At this point, data in the application is hard-coded into a factory, or you might have used a service instead. But either way, that's not very real life. Of course, we probably want to go get that data from some type of remote server, maybe using Ajax. So that's what we're going to talk about here. Now, out of the box, AngularJS provides a lot of different services you can use, and some of these services can be used to make Ajax calls. Primarily, you can use $HTTP, or you can use $resource. Now, I'm going to focus on $HTTP here because it's kind of the core API you can use, the core service. $resource is a little higher level wrapper around that you could also use, but we'll look at HTTP. So the HTTP service is provided out of the box, and it's going to allow you to use the XML HTTP request object to make Ajax calls. Now, all the calls are going to be asynchronous, so we're going to have to handle callbacks, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And it supports a lot of different HTTP verbs. You can do head and get and post and put and delete. You can even do JSON-P calls if you're trying to call some type of a remote server that's maybe a different domain than yours. Now, to use it is actually very straightforward, especially if you handle the callback appropriately. And what I mean by that is in a factory, you can have $HTTP injected in as a parameter, and then you can use it to go get some data from a remote API. Now, in this case, we're going to be calling some RESTful type of service that has API/customers as the relative URL. Now, notice we're going to return that immediately, and this is going to get us into a discussion on promises. What will happen is the get is going to be performed asynchronously, and this would be the case if you do get, put, post, or delete. So we're going to return a little object called a promise, and in this example, we're going to allow the controller to wire up some callback functions for what to do if it's successful and if it fails. So the get call is asynchronous, and it's relying on the HTTP object which is injected. Now, how do we actually handle the data, though, in the caller of this particular API? Well, let's assume that we have a controller and we're calling into a factory or a service, and that factory or service is using HTTP, and then it returns a promise. Well, behind the scenes, AngularJS has a little service called $Q, and it deals with deferred or promise type of objects. And all this is, I think of it like an IOU. If I'm going to go off and do some work and maybe take something from you, I'm going to instantly give you an IOU, and then maybe you go off and do your thing. A few minutes later, I get done with my work, I have the money to pay, and now I come to you and say, hey, here's your money. It's up to you to wire up, though, the callback for the successful payment or the failure type of payment. Now, what we're going to do to access that type of information and to deal with this promise is either call the then function or the success and error functions. So in this example, I'm going to use the success and error, but either one would work. So we're going to call from a controller into customers factory, get customers, you just saw that. And then when the promise is returned, we're instantly going to wire that up to a success callback function and an error callback function. Now, if it's successful, we can go ahead and assign the customers we got back into the scopes customers property, which displays in the table. Now, if there's an error, there's a variety of things we could do, including logging it to the debug console or maybe writing it out to the user interface. So let's go ahead and look at how we can use the HTTP object first off in a factory, and then how we can work with promises in a controller.